Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar here today, looking at this post-COVID world and specifically leadership. We have a fabulous panel of guests, all of whom you'll hear from today. I will be your host. So my name is Georgia Kerr. I'm one of the directors here at LHH, working with clients in the space of leadership development and assessment selection and talent development. For those of you who don't know and who may be watching this in a recording, we're very pleased to have you here. LHH is a global organization working across the space of people development, talent development, including talent identification and succession planning and all the good things that come in there. So we'll be covering a range of topics today. As Christina said in the intro, we will endeavor to have time for questions at the end. So do pop those into the chat as we go along, but we will also try to make time for some questions right at the end. So let me introduce our guests and then we can take it from there. So with us today, we have Claire Barlow, who is the Chief HR Officer from NNL. We have Hannah Mullaney, who is a managing consultant with Saville Consulting, who is quite excited to say one of our newest partners here at LHH. And amongst other things, they are the publisher of the WAVE Professional Styles Questionnaire, amongst other psychometrics. And then, of course, we have Rob Sayers-Brown, one of our own consultants here at LHH, working with clients specifically targeted around leadership and talent identification. So very glad to have you all here today. Now, let me just sort of set the scene here a little bit then. We thought when we were thinking of doing this webinar, we thought it's such a sort of timely point as we've sort of weathered the last 18 months and reached this sort of post-COVID world, whatever that might mean. So Rob, let me go to you first then, and let's talk about sort of the spotlight we now have on leadership. And perhaps those fundamental elements of leadership that are now in the fore. So what are you seeing with clients and what are your views there?
Absolutely, thank you. And I think it's worth acknowledging that the last 18 months have been trying for everyone. And HR, leaders, organizations in general, and what that has prompted over the last 18 months is that return to more technical skills. We've been struggling to keep the lights on, so to speak, and to keep the plates spinning, but some of those fundamental elements of leadership perhaps have taken a backseat because we're focused on the doing. And that as well is further fanned by the fact that more individuals are reevaluating what they value about what they do and their motivational drivers. And that has created this perfect storm, really, where there is this shortage of talent and those individuals that we would then pass the baton to in terms of leadership. So as we emerge now from this pandemic, he says, fingers crossed, touching wood, that certainly in the organizations that I'm working with and speaking to, there's this renewed focus and energy in ensuring they have the right people in the right leadership roles at the right time.
Thank you, absolutely. And so Claire, I'm going to pass to you now and just, I know we've talked a lot with you and your organization a lot over the last few months, and this has certainly been something in your area of focus. So give us your sort of observations and thoughts on this point.
Yeah, thank you. Morning, everybody. I think just replaying sort of where Rob left the conversation, I think what we've seen in the last 18 months is some fantastic leadership in terms of managing a crisis. And I think that to me has been quite profound in terms of, is that the same leadership qualities that we need coming out of a crisis? So as we move to sort of more sustainable leadership, I guess, for want of a better word, I think it's really making certainly our organisation and other organisations that I talk to really question about what it is they need going forward, because it might not necessarily be the same as what's got us to where we are today. And I think we're all hearing these wonderful words around, you know, war for talent, and, you know, I think people are calling next year the year of resignations, and all these elevator pitches. I think what it's making us stop, and we're doing some work with Rob on this at the moment, is really starting to think about, are we succession planning in our leadership population for a crisis, or are we succession planning in our organisation for sustainability? And if it's the second, actually, it means that we're planning for succession planning around the culture of our organisation, not necessarily what we do. And I think that's really turning a few things on its head. I think, you know, we've all gone through the transition over the last few years around succession planning isn't just for technical skills, it's for leadership skills. But I think actually what those leadership skills are going forward are starting to potentially be very different, and probably more aligned to the culture of an organisation. What people are wanting from their leaders and what people are wanting from work. I think everybody's gone through that sort of profound reflection on where work fits in their wider life. I think the organisation and the employees within the organisation are looking for a different type of leadership as a consequence of that as well. So we're just grappling with that at the moment. I don't think there's a quick fix, but that's certainly some of the conversations that we're embarking on at the moment.
Fantastic. And I'm sure, you know, you are absolutely not alone, Claire, in grappling with this. You know, we are, even ourselves here at LHH, even though we obviously work with clients on this range of issues you've talked about. And I think absolutely this sort of move towards sustainability now, it's not just sort of managing through this crisis. We now need to sort of look at what do we need, as well as, you know, as you say, this sort of cultural aspect really important has come into the lens. Hannah, from your point of view, from a, you know, Saville Consulting, share with us your thoughts.
Sure. Yes, lots of organisations are coming to us with gaps, with holes, and more so than pre-COVID. But I think all of the reasons that we've just outlined there, people reevaluating what they want from life, taking early retirement, having a career change, the great resignation we are all reading about is certainly having an impact, I think. You know, and to Claire's point, this idea that what are we planning for here? And the reality is we don't really know. And so in a way, succession planning needs to be quite agile as well. So that's an additional dynamic to sort of chuck in the mix. We're also finding that a lot of organizations actually haven't really had or don't really have a clear structure or a process for succession planning, and they've perhaps felt they've got away with that in the past, or they haven't needed it, it served them fine. But I think the current situation is really shining a light on that. And I think that by not having a really robust, structured process, you're not only going to get into problems with being able to plug those holes, but you also get into D&I issues. So generally, we find mini-me's happening. So particularly if the leader who is to be succeeded is involved, we all, I think, would feel that we should replace ourselves as someone who's just like us. And actually, when you look at more general data, not just leadership data and job analysis data, you find that when you ask a person what do you need to do your job, they don't look objectively at their job. They look inside at themselves and they tell you all of their strengths. And I think actually from speaking to a lot of organizations working on this, I think people sometimes find the challenge of almost managing the leader that is to be succeeded, one of the biggest challenges that they have to deal with. And again, I think, something that is robust, structured, objective can actually help to alleviate some of that, as well as, helping you plug the gaps and deal with D&I more generally.
Thank you, Hannah. And that point around sort of D&I, really, really crucial. We'll come on to that as well. And I loved your comment there of mini-me's. We do talk a lot about the sort of tendency for people to recruit in their own image, exactly that sort of point. If they're like me and kind of behave in the same way, act like me, they'll be fine in the job, which, you know, as Claire pointed out as well, you know, when we need to think more broadly, both from a fairness point of view, as you've said, but the cultural aspect as well. So what do we need sort of going forward? Rob, let me go to you at this point then, and share with us, you know, what do you feel what could organizations be doing then to improve the robustness of selecting leaders for the future?
No, and it's a really good question. And I think it taps into what Claire and Hannah have already said around this piece around sustainability, and that linkage to the culture. Really spending some time up front articulating what it is that we're looking for in our leaders, in our future leaders, and whether that be taking that crystal ball type lens, I think is important to really kind of preempt what are the challenges that the role, the organization even will face in the future, as well as some of those emerging trends, and using that analysis to create a bespoke list of fundamental elements of leadership, which then underpins a mixed method assessment approach, we would call it, which combines a number of data points from personality questionnaires, cognitive assessments, and a deep dive interview that really looks at some of the key psychological processes that are going on underneath the surface to understand some of those strengths and even some of those risks as well. At LHH, we have a model of leadership effectiveness called Acumen, and it's informed by those data points that I just mentioned. And we assess an individual against 11 core aspects of leadership effectiveness and potential, that looks at people-related behaviours like leading with courage, leading through change, being inclusive, task-related behaviours that look at results orientation, as well as some of those thinking capabilities as well about problem solving and taking that more strategic helicopter view too. And I think when working with organisations in a succession planning, development, or a selection scenario, we compare LHH's model with the organisational framework, those behaviours that they've articulated. And it's that marriage that creates a rigorous assessment. We're bringing some of the science-led elements, but we're also incorporating that client-led approach that is bespoke to their context. And I think, more recently, certainly what we're seeing as we're emerging from this pandemic is a real focus on empathy and compassion, becoming front and center. It usually has a bit of a elliptical orbit, and comes back into focus every now and then in terms of its importance, but certainly it is right back in front of us. And empathy is a key element of the Acumen model. But as I say, that focus over the last 18 months has become more pronounced, and I don't see that going away anytime soon either.
Fantastic, and totally agree. I mean, it is what we're seeing around that focus and kind of bringing it forward as something leaders need to do. It's not a sort of nice to have. And also we see this sort of, I think this grappling between the difference between, as you say, empathy, and as we look at in our model, and sympathy, so that two very distinct sort of elements there that, and often the leaders who are sort of very sympathetic struggle with having those difficult situations, but can, be empathetic. Hannah, from the Wave Professional Styles questionnaire point of view, tell us what you're seeing in terms of this point on empathy.
We've got some really interesting data on this, actually, that we came out of a set of analysis that we ran this year because, compassionate leadership, empathy has really come to the fore. So when you look at individual behaviours and their relationship to leadership success, so how predictive are they of leadership success? actually behaviours relating to being attentive to the needs of others, so having empathy, listening to others, understanding other people's motivations, aren't actually predictive of leadership success. And that's not just something we found in our own literature. You see that pattern more broadly. The things that are predictive of leadership success, when you look at behaviours on an individual level, are things like pursuing goals, so drive, directing people, taking action, developing strategies, those sorts of things. However, what we started to do this time was look at combinations of behaviours to try and understand what that changed. And what we found was that individuals who had all of those core behaviours, so pursuing goals, directing people, taking action, developing strategies, and empathy, did better and were more successful than those who just had those core behaviours. So whilst it's not predictive of success on its own, and actually I've done some other research into M&A leaders that shows in some situations having empathy with, can be quite problematic. We see a sort of a negative correlation between that trait and success when we look at it on its own. But yes, if we can kind of gather it in with all of those other core behaviours, you will go much further. The challenge is that what we tend to find is that individuals who do have, those sort of core behaviours, pursuing goals, directing people, taking action, tend to be lower on those sort of attentive kind of empathy listening scales, which kind of makes intuitive sense. It's not to say you can't do both, you can, but those individuals are unusual. What I think it means for us and for organisations is that I think we have to accept that there's a bit of a job to do in terms of getting most leaders who do have those core traits to understand the power of empathy and to learn how to build it, because it's probably not going to happen naturally.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head there around this sort of developable versus core sort of, and where do we draw the line? What is more important? Should we be selecting for empathy first and developing the sort of goal orientation, strategic thinking, or the other way around? And it's a tricky one. I don't think there's any straightforward answer there. Claire, what are you seeing? Given you're in an industry clearly that's very much in the focus at the moment, in particular. But how are you? How important is empathy as a leadership skill in your organization?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think just listening to both Hannah and Rob about the importance of having that sort of competency or that skill as part of a wider system, I think is really important. There's a number of things happening at the moment, and again, it's probably coming out of the pandemic. You've got leaders who are actually rediscovering who they are at the moment. You've got organisations that are rediscovering what they are at the moment, and actually employees and teams who are kind of wondering on the relationship with work and home and them as individuals. Putting all that in the mix, you can see where empathy comes, but I don't think it's just the leaders that need to go on that journey. I actually think you almost need to find a way where you're doing that in parallel as part of a more integrated system. Otherwise, it just becomes that sort of, oh, we've revisited our leadership competencies and we've put the word empathy in now, so we're good to go. And I think it comes back on that sort of process versus sustainability piece. If this is about sustainable leadership and bringing empathy more to the forefront, which is definitely something that we've identified going through the journey that we're going on at the moment, it's how you make that part of the system. And I think you have to look at it from all of those aspects, together. I think it's been interesting, the journey that NNL, my organisation, is going on. Sustainability is a really big part of what we do. We're here for the long-term sort of societal good, I guess, through clean energy agenda, etc. So we're talking about that language in our organisation, and some of the work that we're doing with Rob at the moment is talking about what that means in terms of sustainable leadership to underpin that. But I do think that picking up what Hannah says, and Rob, it needs to be part of an integrated system where you go on that journey with the leaders, rather than just, as I say, token changing a set of leadership competencies to include a word empathy. I think it's much bigger than that. But we're definitely seeing the demand from the employees to see a different type of leader in the organisation, as well as a different type of organisation.
Thank you. And absolutely this point of sort of tokenism, across the board, we do need to be really careful that even sort of there are a lot of buzzwords coming out at the moment, aren't there, in the post-COVID sort of world, and we need to think, more long-term, as you've said, Claire. I'm just going to jump in here with a question that's come in as we're speaking, and perhaps, Claire, you could just elaborate. Someone's sort of talking about, what do we mean by sustainable leadership? So from your point of view, Claire, and I know this is something you're working on at the moment, working through, where are you with that, and how would you define sustainable leadership?
I think before you describe sustainable leadership, which is a great question because it clearly means different things to different people, I think you've got to have a look at your organisation, coming back to that culture word that Rob was talking about before. What does sustainability mean within your organisation? So, for example, at NNL, we're focusing on 3 elements of sustainability. One is around economic sustainability, so longevity of the organisation, providing value. One is environmental sustainability, so that's all about our environmental footprint, which is obviously within our DNA as NNL. But then there's also societal sustainability. So how do we create value and long-term sustainability for individuals, communities, etc. And I think when you can define what you mean within your organisation for sustainability, you then start to ask yourself, and it picks up on what Rob said before, what's that model that best suits your organisation to talk about what are those leadership capabilities that you require for that to be sustainable. And I think, and I use this term quite a bit in work, that's about mindset sustainability, it's about skill set sustainability, and it's about tool set as well. But what does that actually mean? So where does that leadership sustainability come from to meet those wider sustainable goals? So I think they can mean very different things for different organisations.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Claire. And absolutely. I mean, I think implicit as well in our model, and I think other views on leadership, is this point of agility as well. So sustainability is one thing, but needing to adapt as the landscape changes, goalposts change, etc. So thank you for elaborating there. Let's move on a little bit now around, so this is this point around empathy coming more into the fore, although it's always been there and certainly needs to be sort of incorporated, as you've said, Hannah, into the broader sort of view on leadership. But from a team point of view, Rob, I'll go to you at this point. How important do you feel empathy is now from a team point of view and a team perspective? As I know this is you're doing a lot of work in this space at the moment.
I think it's always been there as fundamental, but it's even more critical now than what it has been in the past. And functional teams can't exist without strong bonds of understanding, both to individual needs and desires, but also that longer term kind of sustainability piece that we're touching on here. And empathy within teams creates that strong sense of belonging and safety as well. And it's that allows members to challenge each other, to enter situations of conflict, even with a safety net, and to discuss things without fear and retribution. And it's those discussions that fan the flames of creativity, gives each individual that voice to share their perspective or their opinion, which may even be controversial, but really to add their voice and to feel as though they are included. So creating that sense of belonging. It also helps create that clarity and alignment of purpose. And then that in turn creates that shared accountability and that collective advocacy of that journey for the organisation, and showing that united front. I mean, we always talk about leaders setting the tone, and absolutely that's what this does. And it's those elements that support the accomplishments of results, innovation, adaptability, that organisations need in order to pivot and to be agile in the way that they operate. So certainly in my view, empathy then is fundamental. It's the bedrock of great teams, and without it, that's where problems are rife, really. I mean, we have a model of team enhancement that looks at these aspects, that focuses on cultivating belonging, which then creates that sense of purpose that people can rally behind and alignment against that vision, as well as harnessing shared values, mental models, beliefs that enable that team, that organization to be agile and adapt, which, you know, to Claire's and Hannah's point, it isn't just needed in a crisis. It's fantastic in a crisis, but actually going forward, in order to constantly innovate and move with the times, organizations need those three aspects as well.
Thank you, Robin. And you mentioned that term there, psychological safety, which is one that, again, you could argue is being thrown around as a bit of a buzz at the moment. But, you know, having said that, you know, a lot of our clients are talking about that, the lack thereof, and kind of what can they do to create, you know, to this point of the culture, one that is psychologically safe, where people feel included, they feel they can contribute, they feel they can be themselves and be authentic. Claire, I'm going to come back to you, and I will come back to you, Hannah, don't worry, but I'm just going to go back to Claire at this point on this team aspect, and you know, just tell us a little bit about, you know, your experience within NNL, and how have you worked on this point and sort of improved things, or, you know, the journey you've been on at NNL.
Yeah, what I will say is we were sort of embarking on a team development program before. Life is before and after the pandemic, isn't it? Before the pandemic, and Rob's been very patient as we kept putting things back as we were dealing with the crisis, and we've actually started the work sort of in the last couple of months. And actually, I think there's some richness and some benefit for us actually starting it after what we've just gone through in the last 18 months. Going back to what I said before, I think everybody is questioning things at the moment. What type of leader do we need? What am I? What type of leader am I? What does the team look like? So I feel that we've almost kind of, and I always see things as an opportunity. I actually think we've almost gone back to sort of asking some of those really basic questions about what being in a team at NNL really means, and starting that at a real senior level. The psychological safety bit, I think, again, you're right, it is a bit of a buzzword, but I actually think that's at the core of everything, because people, you know, physically haven't felt safe over the last 18 months. And I think in this hybrid world that we've been living in, I think people's confidence has gone. I think the focus perhaps that organisations have had on team development has been in a crisis lens rather than that sustainability lens. So we really are going back to basics and rebuilding, I think. And some of the work that we've been doing and some of the tools that Rob's been referring to, really going right back to some of those basic team sort of skills, I guess, and principles around, you know, what does it mean to be part of this team? Who am I as an individual? Who am I in relationship to this team? How do we get alignment? How do we get agreement when we don't agree? And then, as Rob rightly said, how we then get advocacy to set that tone. So we really have gone back to go forward, and it's been fantastic. It's been challenging. It hasn't been easy. This is not an easy process. But I think the richness of going through it now, post the pandemic, I think is bringing out more of those kind of words that we've been talking about on this morning's session, having more empathy with people, understanding me in the relationship with the team. It's been very single focused in the pandemic. We've been on the end of a screen in our own world. And I think it's resetting that. And I think it's a fantastic opportunity to reset it for the new world. So yeah, we're really investing in that at the moment, and we're just starting it. You know, it's at the beginning of that process, I guess. But you have to start at the top of the organisation. You go full circle to what we've been talking around about culture and setting the tone. You have to start at the top of that organisation.
And thank you for that, Claire. I think I loved you mentioned, I'd almost call it the 3 A's there. I heard you say sort of agreement, alignment, and advocacy. So, you know, I think you've coined a new phrase there, and I love it. And your point around, you know, making the most of this opportunity. And I think that's what a lot of organizations are doing, you know, never waste a crisis. We've got an opportunity now to go back to basics, to reevaluate, and people are naturally doing that as well when we talk about the great resignation and sort of career sort of planning and the thoughts people are putting into that. Hannah, I'll come back to you. I'm curious to hear from your side. What do you see around how psychometrics can be used to really sort of identify and get to the root of these team dynamics? As Claire said, not easy to do, and not a sort of quick fix.
Definitely. I mean, psychometrics can be as powerful at enhancing team self-awareness as they can in terms of individual self-awareness, sometimes more so actually. And awareness is key to everything that we've spoken about, I think. To go back to Rob's point around sort of belonging, purpose and agility. So I think agility in particular, you can't be agile as a team if you aren't aware of your collective strengths and challenges, and individuals' strengths and challenges as well. We've talked a lot about empathy, which is essentially being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And we've also talked about how this doesn't come naturally to everyone. Not everyone can do this. Some people find it almost impossible, and it's actually one of the skills that's really hard to develop if you don't have it from early on. And so what psychometrics can help do in some of these sort of teaming activities is help individuals and teams understand not just themselves but their colleagues, particularly people who are very different from them. And so it's really hard to then put themselves in their shoes. It helps, I think, see things from a very different perspective. And I think purpose particularly can be quite hard to hit when you have quite a disparate group in terms of personality. I think because there tends to be a little bit of, oh, why are they doing that, or why are they doing it that way? And it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that you're all working towards a common goal. And so, using psychometrics to sort of shine a light on some of that can help, I think, create that kind of shared sense of purpose. And then I think trust is the other things we talked about, kind of psychological safety. Trust is huge and integral to successful team function. And I think just the activity of sharing your psychometric profile with your colleagues, everyone's got to get a little bit vulnerable, and that's when trust starts to build, and you see those kernels that can then start to grow. So absolutely, I think has a place and can be really powerful.
Thanks, Hannah. And that point you say around vulnerability, that the sort of showing one's true self linked with the sort of authenticity, really needs to be there in order to foster this culture of psychological safety and those insights that using a sort of structured psychometric can give. Fantastic. So we've talked a bit about succession planning, the sort of need for it, as it's always been there, but sort of perhaps a bit more of a lens on that, as well as, this point around, strengthening team cohesion, what we can do. Another thing we're hearing a lot of is this sort of a shift really in thinking around performance management. So a lot of clients are coming to us at the moment sort of quite interested in how do we do this, struggling with this in sort of a hybrid world. Does it look different? Should we be doing something, radically, different to what we were doing before? Really a shift from perhaps the sort of structured performance management to creating more of this, culture of a kind of coaching culture, that leaders clearly have a role to play here. Claire, interested to go back to you then and ask you if you've seen a similar shift in your organization as we've seen.
Yeah, and I think just before I answer that specifically, I think the performance development, performance management element is part of that system. When I was saying before about you can't go on the journey just with team development on its own in isolation to what your processes and structures are in your organization. You can't do it in isolation from what your psychometric testing you might be doing, or whatever. I think, you know, you have to take a step back and view it all as part of that system and going on that journey in parallel, I think. We've been it's quite an unusual situation, and from a HR perspective, depending on which journal you read in what month, it's, you know, wave bye-bye to the death of the performance management tool, and hello, performance management's the new future, you know, and I don't think there's a right or wrong. I think it's what fits the culture of your organisation. One of the things that we've done in NNL is we actually don't have performance management or performance review sessions. We have personal development sessions. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do is to say, you know, don't write your policies, your procedures, your culture of how you manage development and performance. Don't make it for, you know, the 10% at the back end of the organisation where you may have some performance management issues. Make it for the majority. And the majority of the organisation, if it's successful, doesn't have a major performance management situation. So that was quite an interesting journey to go on that with the trade unions as well, for what it's worth. So we do very much focus on performance development. And then you come right back round to the role of a leader. You know, and you talked about recruitment and succession planning in your own image. This is the tool, or this is the process, I think, if you're not careful, that you get more of that mini-me in that ongoing development. This is how I develop, this is the training I had, this is the skills I've had, how do I help these people who work for me go on a similar journey? So I think we've got that challenge. And I think coming full circle to the investment in the leadership team about what a cohesive team looks like in NNL, what behaviours, what traits, what tone it sets, you have to answer that first to then go and talk about effective sort of personal development, I guess. But I think coaching and mentoring, going back to your specific question, I think that has to be a way forward, irrespective of whether you have a formal process. Twice a year talking to somebody about how they are, checking in and having empathy with them is not going to cut it. So having something in that system as you're going through these changes that just underpins what you do, I think is really critical. And then you go through that whole conversation. We've gone for a blended approach, having some internal coaching, but having some external as well. I've been in organisations where it's purely an internal coaching mechanism. Not surprised, you know, definition of insanity, you get what you have and what you take forward. So a blended approach is probably the way forward for me. And I think the ED&I lens comes in here as well, especially with performance management in a hybrid world. It's been really interesting for us. We have, as most companies do, we have reward and recognition schemes and, you know, performance sort of development, investment, really making sure that's not just the people that you're seeing and the people that are maybe more visible in this hybrid working, I think comes into that whole performance development piece as well. So we're just playing around with that at the moment. Not to overload, I would just end on one other part of that system as well, is what we've found in terms of making sure we're addressing the strand of not only leadership development and performance development, is what our employment value proposition looks like going forward. I think that's looking very, very different in this new world. And actually, when you start to talk about those skills of your leadership team, it has to be linked to what your value proposition is of, you know, that's sort of why people want to join your organisation. You know, it's way not just about pay and reward anymore. It's about all of those other elements, going right up to purpose that Hannah was talking about before. So again, that's a lens I think that we're just exploring now as an organisation, which is quite challenging and interesting.
Thanks, Claire. And you know, as you've said, that the sort of systemic view that needs to really be taken, and again, not easy to do, but looking at all of these things together, how they fit together, trying to approach them. I mean, it sounds like you're doing a fantastic, albeit, you know, challenging job where you are. And I loved your point there around moving from sort of performance management to you know, the development aspect of it, and that risk you've highlighted of you know, not only as we bring people into an organization or promote them, as we sort of manage and lead people throughout, that risk of sort of the mini-me, the kind of developing in our own image, you could say, rather than recruiting in our own image. Hannah, interested to hear your observations on this space, you know, coming back to DE&I, you know, clearly, you know, big risk when we talk about these biases that can creep in. as well as, as Claire said, the hybrid aspect of out of sight, out of mind. Will the people in the office get preference? So what are you seeing, Hannah, in your work?
Absolutely. And I think the hybrid situation presents a real challenge, actually, just referencing what Claire had said there around, yes, being seen matters. And I think we are seeing, data and research coming out that suggests that the more you're seen, the more likely you are to be promoted. And I think we're in grave danger of rolling backwards, actually, from a D&I perspective. It wouldn't surprise me if we find that women perhaps choose to work from home more, because unfortunately at the moment women still carry most of the burden of caring responsibility, and so that could really negatively impact women and other groups. And I think whatever process you have, there's always going to be an element of evaluation. Someone needs to make a decision, or some people need to make a decision about when to promote, for example. And when you have I think you have to be a bit careful, because when you have no structure in place, that's when you're really inviting bias in. And there's evidence to show that evaluation tends to favor the dominant group, which in most organizations, or at least on most decision panels, although some organizations are trying to make this different, mostly it is white, straight, cis, able-bodied males. People may have read this. If not, go and read it. It's such a fantastic book. But Caroline Criado Perez's Invisible Women cites this piece of research that has stuck in my mind ever since I read it, which was looking at how men and women were evaluated in US tech companies. The sample was about 250 people or so. They found that men and women were evaluated quite differently. Women were more likely to receive negative feedback than men. And then the language that was used in feedback was strikingly different. So I'm going to read off a list here because it's quite specific. So for women, were told to watch their tone, step back, they were bossy, they were abrasive, they were strident, they were aggressive, they were emotional, and they were irrational. None of those words, apart from aggressive, appeared in men's feedback. And in 2 of those cases, it was suggesting that those men should be more so. And I think this visibility issue is likely to exacerbate bias. And so I actually think there's even more of a need for tools that can help structure, systemize and objectify evaluation and decision-making processes. So that's something we're talking to clients a lot about at the moment.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, and great book. We'll make a note in the chat of that book recommendation. So we're covering lots of ground here. We could almost, could we have a book club going forward? Who knows? So yeah, love that, Hannah, around, the risk that we've got actually of moving backwards. So much effort has gone in, so much progress has been made, but we are seeing, unfortunately, a bit of a worrying trend, which of course needs to be addressed. But again, big another conversation probably for another day to go into that. Rob, I'm going to come back to you at this point to talk about, what can we do then, given everything we've talked about, the responsibility leaders have to navigate the challenges we've got to navigate in this new post, whatever we want to call it, COVID hybrid world. What can we do then? How can we equip leaders to thrive in this world?
Yes, and I love everything that both Claire and Hannah have said, particularly around this point around the power of language as well. And I think I'll come back to that point, but yes, on top of my head, there are a number of things organizations can do to support their leaders. The first for me really relates to leaders showing that curiosity regarding employees, drivers and motives. And what we know from behavioral science is that once we've highlighted those personal values and strengths and motivations and take active steps to leverage those and move towards those in what we do at work, we maintain greater energy, job satisfaction, and organisational commitment. And psychometric assessment can really add some value here, particularly as drivers can shift throughout the course of our lives, and particularly over the last 18 months, to allow managers, bosses, leaders to have those conversations which are informed by robust data and create that catalyst for that really rich conversation around what they can do as a leader to unlock that energy. The second element for me is about casting the net widely to gather feedback and the demonstration of behaviour in terms of reputation. And 360, for example, can add some real power to this, and also aids in that leader being very mindful of those biases that we've talked about already in creation of those mini me's. It's about looking more holistically and widening that lens to take in more diverse views in relation to performance and reputation. The third element is about using enablement facilitation styles in these conversations to help employees grow, build their confidence, and reinforce learning. And the fourth element, I think, really is linked to this third element. It's around, to Claire's point, around using these coaching behaviours. Rather than taking that more directive hands-on stance, it's about cultivating a forward-looking approach by asking, not telling. And through those conversations, you really just get at the real crux of what motivates an individual and what that leader can do, tapping into that empathy to help support that individual to unlock all of their energy and potential. And, you know, I think what we've seen particularly, and I love, again, you know, Claire, you mentioned about personal development sessions, again, power of language here. I think these four elements that I've talked through there, they're not new. And I think organisations think they need to reinvent the wheel. They don't. It's almost, again, reverting back to basics, pressing that pause button and going back to some of those fundamental elements. One thing we have seen is that the pandemic has created a bit of a paradigm shift where performance is not just about the return on investment of that individual, but it's the return on the individual, which I think is that real power of that language. And leaders play a massively crucial role in enabling that.
Thanks so much, Rob. And you know, I love that sort of point you make around, you know, we're not reinventing the wheel here, and organizations don't need to feel that they need to do that. It's just this shift we're seeing of focus and language sometimes, you know, focusing on leaders being more curious as to the motivations, the drivers of the people, you know, they lead, you know, gathering those more diverse views, you know, and you know, using coaching, more of the coaching style of asking, you know, linked to the above, really, you know, asking as opposed to sort of telling and kind of, here's how I would do it, here's how you should do it approach. We're quite short of time. I'm just looking, we've got a question, we might have time for one question, and I might throw this to you, Hannah, around, you know, we've talked about D&I. What could organizations do to expedite sort of improving D&I in your opinion?
It's not a simple answer. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet. We have all our we have all our biases because we live in an incredibly biased society from a structural perspective. So no one organization can solve this problem, and it will take years to do. And so I think you take a two-pronged approach. You make sure people understand that, and you create a culture where it's, so going back to psychological safety, it's safe to talk about that. It's safe, people feel that it's safe to call people out, and people feel that it is safe for them to be called out. And then it's about this structure as well. The more structure and standardization we can put into a process, the more it sort of stamps on our biases. That it's like the checks and balances, if you like. So that I think that two-pronged approach is the way to do it, but it's not going to completely solve it overnight, unfortunately.
And as you've said, Hannah, thank you for those. I mean, that there's so much in there, and I think what I want to we're gonna close here. I want to thank everyone who's joined us today. We've covered a lot of ground. We will be drawing up some of these observations, insights we've discussed into a document, which we'll share to you if you're watching this afterwards as well in a recording. And we also intend to run future sessions just talking about these real important issues that we're seeing, and perhaps focus on one or two so we can go more deeper dive. But thank you all for attending, and fantastic. Thank you to my guests today and your contributions, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.